Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in the third series of American English Live Teacher Development. My name is Lauren, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, moderator Heather, who will be serving as moderator to help answer your questions and respond to your comments throughout the session. Today, Kate will be talking with Jennifer Bork about using social media to engage students and teach narrative writing. So let's go ahead and get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As Lauren said, I'm Kate, and I work here in Washington, D.C. at the Office of English Language Programs, and I am part of the American English social media team. We are very excited to have you here today, and I'm definitely happy to be your host and facilitator today. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to our first-time viewers, and for those of you who have joined us before, we're happy to see you again. Please let us know in the comments if this is your first time or if you've joined us for many times. Thank you so much for being here. Let's start with these American English Live Teacher Development viewing group photos featuring teachers at the English Language Office at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and at the American Corner in Tunis, Tunisia. Special thank you to those who submitted these wonderful photos. And we love to see teachers learning and sharing together. So please submit your photos as well. You can email them to us at the email on your screen there, americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org, or tag us on social media at American English for Educators or using the hashtag American English. We hope to feature your viewing group photos in the next session. So let's review our exciting lineup for this series. Our presentations for Series 3 are on the topics of service learning in the language classroom, professional development for teacher trainers, and strategies for teaching multi-level or large classrooms. So we're looking forward to learning more throughout today and then the final 3 after today of this series. So stay tuned, and we hope to see you for the rest of the sessions as well. So here's a little bit about what to expect. Each session is approximately 60 minutes long and is usually linked to a Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website. We hope that you find those resources useful. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments as well. But we really do hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas, your context, your experiences, and of course your questions. So please put your questions and comments in the chat box or in the comments section, and we'll do our best to address all of them live. When our session comes to a close in about an hour, you will have an opportunity to receive a digital badge. So at the end of the session, we're going to share a link that will take you to a quiz. And you just need to click on the link and complete the short quiz, answer 2 out of 3 questions correctly, and then within about a week, you'll receive your digital badge from American English at state.gov. So don't worry, the quiz is not too difficult. If you're able to stay with us for the whole hour, you should have no trouble completing it. And also, we're going to leave this link open until Monday, October 8th. So if you'd like to watch the recording and take the quiz later, feel free to do so. Or if you have a colleague who was unable to make it and you want to share the recording with them, they can also take the quiz at a later time. So we look forward to seeing your responses. Have you registered yet for the American English eTeacher Massive Open Online Course, or MOOC? It's called Professional Development for Teacher Trainers, and we hope to see all of you there. So be sure to register today. The course orientation begins next week, and the 5-week course itself begins on the 15th of October. So this massive open online course, this free online course, is designed for both new and experienced teachers. And it gives participants methods for creating, presenting, and evaluating effective teacher training workshops. So you will gain tools and techniques for promoting and providing professional development in your teaching context. If you receive 70% or higher throughout this course, you will receive a digital badge. So please go to the link listed on your screen, www.aeeteacher.org/MOOC, to register today. And now for today's session, embracing social media to engage students and teach narrative writing. Integrating technology in the classroom allows teachers to connect with 21st century learners to create authentic and entertaining language learning opportunities. Linking popular social media platforms to the academic writing process minimizes learner anxiety and maximizes enthusiastic participation. So during this session, you, our participants, will gain insight into how incorporating social media platforms in the classroom makes narrative writing more authentic, attainable, and enjoyable for students. And you'll develop the necessary skills to implement these engaging writing activities or to share them with a colleague. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Jennifer Bork. Jennifer has spent most of the past 20 years working in language education in the United States and around the world. She's worked on language and culture projects and teacher training initiatives in Morocco, Vietnam, and France. In the United States, she works primarily with refugee background students. Originally from the state of Vermont, Jennifer holds a master's degree in TESOL from St. Michael's College and a master's degree in French from the University of Vermont. Welcome, Jennifer. We're happy to have you today.
Thanks for that introduction, Kate, and thanks to all of you for being here on American English Live today. I'm Jennifer, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you about embracing social media in our English language classrooms and talking about how we can engage students through those platforms, and also some specific ideas about how to teach narrative writing using social media. So let's just jump right in and start with our session goals. So first today, we're going to consider the benefits of social media integration in the classroom. Think about why it would be a good idea to incorporate it. Then we'll make some specific connections between social media experiences and the narrative writing process, so we can actually tie social media to some of our learning objectives. And finally, we'll explore strategies to teach narrative writing through Facebook and brainstorm some extension activities that you might have.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Fantastic. So let's get started. First, I have a question for our audience, which is, what is social media? What are social media platforms for you in your countries, in your context? What do your students use already, and what might you use in your own personal life?
All right, yeah, let's hear from you, everyone. What platforms do you use, and what platforms do your students use? I personally really like Instagram because I love taking photos and sharing photos with my friends. How about you, Jennifer? What's your favorite?
Well, I like Instagram for certain audiences. I like to keep that for my artsy photos.
Mm-hmm.
And then I like to communicate more personally with my friends over Facebook.
Great. Yeah, it looks like Rahila says Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Yusuf says he uses mostly Facebook. Henna says that in her context, they use mostly Facebook and WhatsApp groups. Looks like Shuhu says WhatsApp. Lots of people saying Facebook and Instagram. Leslie says Instagram. And Zuhal says that he uses it to know the latest news in the world. Tuba Abdullah says that her students are using Edmodo, and she also uses WhatsApp and Instagram. And Habib says Facebook and Twitter. So it looks like we have a lot of variety in terms of what people are using, but I've seen a lot of Facebook and I've seen a decent amount of Instagram and WhatsApp.
Yeah, I think
Great.
That's a really great collection and a summary of some of the different apps that are out there. And depending on where you're located, those apps will probably vary, but I would agree, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, WeChat, there's so many options out there. So the next question we would want to ask is, what are some of the benefits of thinking about bringing social media into the classroom?
Yeah, what do you think, everyone? What are some of the benefits of using social media in your classroom? What do you think? How could it help your students with their language learning process and goals? And how could it help you maybe as a teacher as well? So what are some of the benefits? Let me think. If I think about the benefits of using social media in the classroom, I think it kind of helps make the classroom a little more relevant. What do you think, Jennifer?
I would agree. I think we're always striving to make our language learning authentic for students. And if this is something they're doing in the real world, why not try to mesh our language learning goals with some authentic activity?
Yeah, and Morella says it's encouraging and students have fun. Let's see. Shamila says people are more open with each other and they share their ideas. Aisha says students can communicate and interact with a wider audience. Great, so a lot of great ideas. And Lizzie says that it's convenient for communication and sharing ideas.
I like that one.
Great.
Very accessible and easy to use. So we're going to talk a lot about the benefits of social media in the classroom today because that's what this presentation is about. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that sometimes there can be challenges with bringing devices such as phones and tablets and computers into the classroom. So I'd love to hear what you all think some of the challenges might be, if you could anticipate those as a teacher.
Great. What are some of the challenges? I want to say quickly, though, that Floy says it helps with diversity and multiculturalism. I like that benefit. Anyhow, but what are some of the challenges that occur or that might occur if you incorporate social media into your classroom? Let's see. During our first session that was at 8 a.m. today, we heard a lot of people say that sometimes social media or using phones in the classroom can be a distraction. Have you ever found that to be the case, Jennifer?
I have. I found that distraction is sometimes one of the biggest challenges. Are there any other suggestions? Because
Let's see. Yeah, Shamila says that the teacher has to be very cautious. Marilla says that the students might get distracted or start chatting. Lin Zhang says they might become too dependent on it.
Ah, great.
Or Fatima says they might use it incorrectly or maybe inappropriately. Great ideas, everyone. Thank you for sharing.
Those are all great ideas. And I think it's important to spend just a minute talking about those challenges since we'll be focusing so much on the benefits and acknowledge that there are some challenges and that perhaps classroom management is the way to get around some of the things that you're anticipating right now, such as distraction or students using devices inappropriately. And spending some time at the beginning of a class talking about guidelines and expectations. If we have a phone in class, it should be turned upside down when we're not using it and turned facing you when it's time to use the phone, or your computer should be closed when we're not using it, but open when we're doing an activity. So it does rely a little bit on the teacher to create that classroom community and to manage expectations so students know what they're going to do when it's time to access those devices in a social media friendly classroom.
Yeah, and I have one more from Mo Hussein Med. He says that unfortunately they don't have the internet in the classroom and most students are not allowed to use social media websites. But I have a feeling, Jennifer, that you might be sharing some ideas for people in his context or his situation.
Yes, that's actually a perfect transition to our next point, which is finding your comfort zone. And I want to emphasize that although this presentation deals with social media, each of the activities that we're going to talk about are designed to be high-tech, low-tech, or even no-tech activities. So each one will rely on students' familiarity with a social media platform outside the classroom. And then depending on your context, you can decide how to implement the activity. So if you have a high-tech classroom, your students could be actively engaged online with you and you could be projecting live as you teach. In my own situation, when I developed these activities, I was in a low-tech classroom where we did not have devices or access to the internet, but I did have at least an overhead projector and I could show screenshots from pre-prepared lesson plans to put up for students to work with. In the case of a no-tech class, marker and a piece of paper. It just relies on students' background knowledge of social media more so than access to that social media while you're actually teaching.
Wonderful. And just so everyone knows, we're going to see some excellent examples of ways to do the strategies that Jennifer is going to share in high-tech and low-tech context. So stay tuned for that.
Great. So since we've acknowledged some of the challenges that we may have both in classroom management and in technology, I think it's important now to talk about the benefits of using social media. So I've listed a few here. You listed a few as well. So let's just talk through these. The first one I'd like to talk about is motivation. I think we recognize that 21st century learners are clued into social media, they're connected, they have hours every day online, whether they're posting updates to their various accounts or filming videos, and they have an innate motivation to be connected to people through social media. So it's motivating for them to have an opportunity to bring that into their learning environment. Then another benefit would be the idea of relaxation. And as language teachers, we talk about the affective filter and the need to bring that down to help students relax and reduce their anxiety when we're trying to teach them new language skills. And one of the best ways to do that is to give them a platform with which they are actively engaged and already familiar, so they can complement that with some of the new skills that we're teaching them in language. A third benefit of bringing social media into the classroom is familiarity, and the idea that students are probably at least or more familiar with these platforms than we are as teachers. And I like to point out here that this is a great time to do a little role reversal and give your students the opportunity to teach you something. So once you know what social media platforms they prefer and what they use most in their personal lives, take the opportunity to let them teach you about that platform and teach you how to use it well. And then you as the teacher can think about how you can accomplish your learning objectives through that social media platform. So setting these new language skills into a familiar setting makes it easier for students to relax, reduces their anxiety, and also lets them show off a little bit about some of the tech skills that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Another benefit that you can get from social media platforms in the classroom is audience awareness. This is something that's really difficult to generate in a narrative writing situation because we're often asking students to write. We ask them to think about an audience, but in fact, they may be writing for an audience of one if the only person who ever reads their writing is their teacher. The difference with social media is that students have already established audiences. Often they are massive audiences. They have subscribers and followers and friends on their various social media platforms. And when we're asking students to post on social media, to post their writing there, all of a sudden there's a real audience that they know and connect with regularly. And they are acutely aware of exactly where their writing is going and who's going to be reading it. So each time they write, they already do this. They think about who's going to be reading this and how are they going to react. And they think about the impact of their writing on their audience very naturally this way. Another benefit we have is the benefit of exchange. When you write in a classroom for your teacher to read, there's very little exchange about what you've written. Perhaps I'll comment on my students' work and perhaps we'll have a discussion about it. But when you post writing on social media, you get an immediate reaction. Students will have comments, likes, reactions, and discussions that will start within seconds of posting something on social media. So it's a really unique opportunity for students to actually have a dialogue about their writing, for the readers or their audience to ask questions, and for writers to be able to follow up and think about the comments that their audience is posting to possibly make changes to their writing. And then the final benefit I would like to talk about is just the idea of efficiency and how social media platforms really do force us to be efficient in our writing. They force us to choose our words carefully because we may have limited characters with Twitter, or we may just be targeting an audience with a 2 or 3 sentence post of some kind, because people rarely scroll through social media and read paragraphs at a time. So it forces students to think about clarity and word choice in a way that's hard to do in a classroom.
Great. I love that you bring up all of these benefits. And I think a lot of our audience really agrees with you on a lot of these. Gustavo says that they love social media. It's part of their lives. And I think that speaks to the familiarity piece. Students are already familiar with using these types of things, so they are probably even more motivated to use them in the classroom and to share what they know with you. And Alexander similarly says they already use it every day, and taking advantage of that for learning is definitely a plus. And I definitely agree. And I would say my favorite benefit in this list is probably audience awareness, which we had a few comments on as well. I like that idea of bringing an audience that's real and more authentic for our students. So instead of just the teacher, they have a real public audience that they're sharing their writing with. So thanks for sharing these great benefits.
I agree. So I think if we can all agree that social media in the classroom is a creative and engaging idea, it's important to think about how we actually tie it to our learning objectives, because that's why we're here. So the first thing you need to do is really be able to recognize similarities between what students publish on social media platforms and your own academic objectives. And this requires being familiar with the platform. So have your students teach you if you need to, and then thinking through how what they're doing online can relate to your teaching goals. Secondly, you're going to want to clearly demonstrate those similarities to students to engage them in your lesson and build their confidence to try out their new skills in this familiar setting. So you want to show students that there is academic value behind what you're doing by asking them to bring social media to the classroom, and you're going to clearly make some connections between the two. And then finally, you'll want to think carefully about your language learning activity so you can strategically incorporate social media into it.
Great. One question was, what if students are afraid to use social media? Maybe if they don't feel comfortable or something like that, have you ever had that kind of experience?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, whether it's a question of student comfort or security. And I would just like to say again that all the activities that I'll present here are based on familiarity with the platform, but there's no need to actually post anything live if students are uncomfortable with that. They can do all of the activities, sharing within a group in the classroom the same way they would in a regular class. And there's no need to turn it live if people are not comfortable with that.
Great. So on the opposite end, real quick, the embassy folks in Cuba who are watching with a viewing group, I believe, said that these types of activities might actually be helpful for shy students if they're able to work on something more in an online setting or on their phone. They might be able to express themselves in new ways. So thank you for that comment as well.
Great suggestion. So then I think one thing we might like to think about is, what is the real value in all of this? So if we as teachers are saying social media is great, we have some learning objectives that are tied to it, you may in fact still have skeptics. If you are trying to convince a group of teachers or administrators or even students that social media in the classroom has value, you need to think about how you can do that. And I have found that the best way to actually convince the skeptics is to really immerse them in an activity, engaging social media in an English language learning lesson and showing them how it works, and then just asking them to reflect on it and to see if at the end they can see the educational value. Usually it works pretty well. So at this point, that's what I would love to do, is just go through some specific activities and show you how you might do this with a group of students.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So before you begin any activity, it's really important to do planning as you would with any lesson. And the first thing you'll want to do is think about your audience. You need to know your audience and decide whether you're talking to students you've been working with throughout the semester, or whether you may have a group of teachers that you're training, or just a group of students that you've never met before. It will be important to know their background. You'll also want to review your academic content. Once again, if you've been working with students throughout the semester, you've probably been progressively building to this activity. But if you have a group of new participants, you'll need to build similar background knowledge before you can proceed with any specific activities. Third, you want to think about your learning objectives and the technology needs that you'll have to make sure that you tie your lesson to those learning objectives, and also you have access to whatever technology you think you need, or you make accommodations and do things with markers and paper. And finally, plan for visual support. So know your context. We talked about being comfortable in your own context and know what it is you have in your classroom and what's achievable. And if you don't have technology at all, go in prepared with drawn posters to show students exactly what you'd like them to do. So plan as you would for any lesson. And then we're ready to launch.
Sounds good.
So our first step is setting the scene for our audience. The first thing we'll need to do is establish a model text. So a model text is a piece of writing that we can look at as readers to make ourselves better writers. Basically, we're going to analyze a model text so we can see the different pieces of narrative writing and understand how they fit into a plot or a storyline, and then think about how we can do the same thing as writers.
All right, so by model text, do you mean an example story?
I do, I mean an example story.
Okay, cool, that's another way of thinking about it. And could you remind us what, so I think if we're talking about stories, I think maybe narrative writing relates to stories. Exactly. Can you remind us of the definition again of narrative writing?
Sure. So narrative writing can be any kind of storytelling. And when we teach narrative writing, we often break it down into personal narratives, which are stories about yourself, real life stories that happen to you, or fictional short stories where you're creating a story from your mind. So sometimes we differentiate between those two and talk about their differences. Yet one thing we'll show through this social media application is that they're much closer than we think, and it may not be necessary to differentiate. So if we just say that narrative writing is telling a story, it's an all-encompassing definition.
Great.
Okay, so once we have a model text, meaning a common text that everyone knows and has read, we can review storytelling vocabulary, talk about the important academic words that we'll need to do the activity. We'll also review the plot line of the story and talk about how a plot moves forward to move a story from the beginning to the end. And then we will also identify a purpose and create some enthusiasm for storytelling. And I'd love to put this question to the audience, which is, why is it important to be a good storyteller?
Ooh, good question. Why is it important to be a good storyteller? What do you think, everyone? Why is storytelling important in the language classroom, and why in general is it important to be a good storyteller? Well, let's see. One thing I think of as we're looking for responses is I think telling stories often helps you to connect to other people. Maybe they think, oh, I have a similar experience. What do you think? Is that a good answer?
I agree. I think we are all about making connections, and stories do really connect us.
Yeah, and Rami says, because you can learn from the experiences of others. I love that answer. Henna says it helps to develop the interest and involve students. And Nahid says it can attract our audience, and Sarwat says it can grab the attention of our audience, very similar. Maimuna says it enhances students' imagination. Asan says to keep learners engaged. Faisal says it catches the interest of students. Ling Zhang says you can produce surprises. So maybe some of those surprises might be learning more about a student, maybe something that you didn't know.
Those are all great responses.
Wonderful, great.
Well, the reason I ask you this question is when I originally developed some of these activities, it's because I was struggling with convincing my students that there really was a purpose behind learning how to be storytellers. I was working with graduate students who were advanced level English students. Many of them were teachers, and they had been writing research papers for a really long time. They were great at research. They knew how to do it. And when I threw them into narrative writing, it was really difficult for them. And they were nervous and anxious and didn't understand the purpose of learning to be storytellers and the relevance to their own life. So I had to figure out a way to show them that storytelling was really a relevant goal for us. So I showed them the following quote, which is, "Those who tell the stories rule the world." And I just asked them to think about that. And in fact, we came around to this discussion of how people who rule the world, whether they're world leaders, politicians, religious leaders, teachers, we're all storytellers. And every day we're telling stories in the classroom as teachers. Politicians are telling us stories about things maybe from their childhood or things that are happening every day. Religious leaders do the same things in lesson teaching in religious settings. And they realize that in each of these cases, these people who make an impact and influence people are all excellent storytellers. And they realize that stories are something that we use to inspire people, to gain followers, to gain people's confidence, sometimes to change people's minds. So it really is an effective social skill that all leaders often have. So we gave it a purpose and convinced students that storytelling really was important, as learning how to do great research.
Wonderful. And a lot of our participants agree with you.
Great.
And love this quote.
All good. So the next step is really to move forward with the activity, and we need to establish a model text, which we just briefly talked about, which the idea behind this is that we want students to all begin the discussion with the same level of background knowledge. So we need to choose a story which all students are familiar with. If you have not been working with them throughout the semester, you'll need to go to something that is familiar to all students. So I often try to choose something that cuts across cultures and languages, that's accessible for all levels of readers, and that many people have heard whether or not they've read it before. Sometimes showing a short video clip or an audio clip of your model text is useful just to refresh your group's mind about the story that you'll be telling in class. I'd love to know if you have any suggestions for good model text that you might use in your context.
All right, everyone. So what do you think? What are some good stories from your culture or context that might be good to use as a model text or an example story? And earlier, Salah Camille wrote the stories of Sinbad, Cinderella, and Beowulf. Would be interesting to share. Great idea. What else do you think, everyone? What other ideas do you have for a model text that might work? And while you're at it, if you want, you can guess what story Jennifer might be referring to by this lovely image she has on the slide. Let's see, Zula says Layla and the Wolf. That's a story in Iraq. Thank you for sharing. Let's see. Aisha asks, what is the criteria to select the model text? And I think Jennifer was sharing a little bit, maybe that it's something familiar. And she's also going to share some ideas about the types of narrative text that we're looking for. Another story about Alibaba. Tortoise and the Hare, that was from the embassy in Cuba. Let's see, the story of the alchemist from Abdullah. And Imelda says it depends on the level you're teaching, which I think is a good point, because maybe depending on their level, you might choose a different story. So wonderful responses, everyone.
Those are all great choices. And I think what we see from all those responses is that often folk tales or fairy tales are something that is accessible to everyone at every level, which is also a good point. Because if you choose something like Cinderella, for instance, which is the one that I often choose, it usually touches all audiences. Adults remember the story from their childhood. Most children have heard the story, and it is a story that's told in countries throughout the world, whether she goes by Cinderella or a different name, and in many, many different languages. So if you choose a model text that is accessible to everyone, you'll be more likely to be successful. And once you have that model text, then we can move on to talking about the elements of narrative storytelling. So we talk about 5 important elements in telling a story, and those are characters, setting, plot, theme, and the point of view. And it's helpful to review the definitions of those words with students who may not be familiar with them, or even to review them with students that you've been teaching all semester, and talk about how characters are who is in the story, who is acting in this story. The setting is when and where your story is taking place, so the time and the location. The plot refers to what's actually happening in the story, what's the action. The theme is the message or the moral of the story. And the point of view is the perspective from which the story is being told. Is it an all-knowing narrator, or is it being told from the perspective of one of the characters? So once you review the vocabulary, I find that it's really helpful to put some specific ideas to match the vocabulary. So you can look at the model text to make some pairings, and you can ask students to do this for you. So for instance, now that they remember what characters are, you can ask them to brainstorm who are the characters in Cinderella. And they'll come up with Cinderella, the prince, the evil stepsisters, the fairy godmother, perhaps the evil stepmother as well. And then what's the setting for Cinderella? And it's probably Cinderella's cabin or house and the prince's castle. The plot, in this case, it's more of a main idea. We've talked about what the main action is in this story. And the idea is that a poor girl marries a rich prince thanks to help from her fairy godmother. You could ask students to brainstorm the theme of the story, and there may be more than one theme. The one I've chosen for Cinderella is to never stop dreaming. And then finally talk about the point of view. Depending on the version of the text that you've chosen, the point of view may be different from what you're used to. The Cinderella version that I usually use as a model text is told in the third person omniscient point of view, meaning there's a narrator from the outside who knows everything and can tell us in his all-seeing way what's happening in the story.
Great. This is a really great review. We had a couple of people talk about how the review piece is so important. And just as a reminder to everyone, these slides and the recording will stay here on social media, and we're also going to share them on americanenglish.state.gov. So if you want to use or adapt these templates when you review narrative writing with your students, you can feel free to do so. So great. Let's continue.
Okay, super. So once we've talked about the essential elements of narrative writing, we can then move on to talking about the plot. And I would start by showing my students a plot diagram like the one that you see here. Sometimes we call this a story mountain or a plot diagram. It outlines the process of a story from beginning to end. And one idea is to put the plot diagram up if this is something you've done before, and ask someone to remind you what this shows. Or if you're teaching this for the first time, then you can specifically go through the elements of a plot diagram and talk about the vocabulary. So at the start, we have beginning or exposition, where the story begins, rising action, which leads us up to the climax or the conflict at the middle of the story. And then we have falling action, which are events that lead us towards the ending or the resolution. And once again, it will be important to talk about definitions behind this vocabulary. So on the next slide, I have some of the definitions for you. So exposition is the beginning, and you can point out that this is where we meet characters and the scene is set. And then the rising action are events in the early part of the story that move it forward toward the conflict or the climax. And the climax is that problem in the story that needs to be resolved. It's usually the high point in the action of the story. The falling action would be action or events that move the story towards the ending. And then finally, the resolution is the ending of the story, which shows how the conflict was resolved. And in the case of fairy tales, it often ends with happily ever after. So once we have established that plot diagram and students understand the vocabulary, once again, now we can ask students to take the model text and put specific examples into the plot diagram to show their understanding. This is a great way of assessing whether or not they've understood what you've done. One of my recommendations with this next activity is to do a scramble, to give students the 6 essential plot elements in your story, mix them up, and ask them to read them and decide where they would fit on this plot diagram. And what you see here is a completed plot diagram for Cinderella with some specific examples for students. The first one, the beginning, is Cinderella lives a miserable life with evil stepsisters. The rising action, Cinderella goes to the ball with the help of her fairy godmother, moving towards our conflict at the top, where Cinderella loses her shoe as she leaves the ball. The following action is the prince searching all over for this beautiful woman who lost her shoe. And then, of course, finding Cinderella, finding that the shoe fits her foot, and determining that she's his true love. And then the ending, where Cinderella and the prince get married and live happily ever after.
What a great story.
What a great story.
and I love the activity of the scrambling the pieces of the plot and having students plug that in. I think that's a really great piece of the review process. So thanks for that example.
Yeah. So now that you've established this model text and your students are familiar with the important academic vocabulary, they're familiar with the idea of the plot line again, we can really launch into our first social media activity and connect social media to our learning objectives. And the first thing that we'll do is create a personal status update. This is going to be an individual activity that students practice. The first thing you'll do as a teacher is to display a status update template, which you'll see shortly. Then you'll display a sample status update, pointing out the different tools that are available to enhance a post on a status update. Then you'll ask students to quickly create their own personal status update. This is a perfect example of pen and paper work just fine, or if you happen to be in a high-tech classroom, they could actually be doing this on their own account. Then you'll have students share their updates and explain how they've used each of the tools to enhance their posts. This really can be done in small groups, or it can be done as a large class with just a few volunteers demonstrating. And then finally, your goal is to reflect and connect and discuss how these status updates actually mirror the essential elements of narrative writing. So let's take a look at that.
Let's go for it.
Okay, so the first step is to display a blank status update template and remind students about the kinds of information that you have on this. So first of all, they can see the photo video option, and you just remind students that this is where, if they are working with a pen or pencil, they're going to want to draw a picture of what it is that they're actually doing to complete a status update, but they could upload a photo or video if they're online. The next one that we have is the check-in option, and just remind them that this is indicating the location of where they are, perhaps just the city or maybe the university where they're sitting. Next, we have the feeling and activity component with the emoji that allows students to describe how they're feeling in the moment when they're posting this status update. Then there's the option to tag friends, which allows students to indicate who's in a photo with them, or it also allows them to target a particular audience for their post by tagging them and saying, read this. So you'll display that template, and then you can display a sample, as you'll see on the next slide, of your own personal status update to remind.
Nice photo, by the way, Jennifer. It looks great.
This was a thoughtful moment planning presentation. So if you display a very basic status update, so students understand that it doesn't need to be a big creative idea, you're just asking them to do what they're doing in the moment and post it. And show them that you've used all of the different accessories along the way. So in my case, you can see that I used the feeling. I chose the emoji of feeling thoughtful. My location was Jericho, Vermont, which is my home. I talked about what's on my mind. I was thinking hard about the next steps in this presentation and dreaming of coffee. Put a little hashtag for coffee lover. And then I inserted a photo of myself. But once again, you could do this in a low-tech way and just insert a drawing as well and do this completely by hand. And then you set students loose and ask them to do the same thing. that you've just done with their own personal status update.
This is great. And of course, I think we have a lot of coffee or tea drinkers out there who really love that piece of the morning or that energizer when you're going through a rough day. But I think this is great. And I love how you use this example and can share it with students, and then they can also share similar updates. So this is a great example. Thanks.
You're welcome. So that is the next step, is the sharing piece. So now you'll ask students to create their status update, share their own, whether it's in a small group or with the larger group. And in doing so, just check in to make sure they've included those accessories, that they've indicated location and friends that they're with and how they were feeling, and they've used each component that's available to them. If they haven't, you can ask specific questions about their post to remind them to add some of those things. And once they have done that, the reflection part comes along, which is really the piece where we are going to tie this Facebook status update to our learning objectives. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see the blank status update again. And this is where we're going to ask students to think about what each of these accessories on the status update, each of the tools, how they connect to narrative writing. So I would put up a list, if we click one more time, that will show the different components of narrative writing again, just as a reminder. So we have characters, setting, plot, theme, and point of view. And then I would ask students to identify how each of the Facebook tools fits into these elements of narrative writing. So I might start by asking them about the photo and video option. Let's put that question to the audience. How does that connect to an element of narrative writing?
Yeah, what do you think, audience? How does the photo or video element connect to the narrative elements? So would that fall under characters, setting, plot, theme, or point of view? What do you think? What would that photo piece, how would that connect to the narrative elements? Let's see. As we're waiting for some responses to come in, I think maybe, does it have to do with setting? That would be my guess, maybe setting.
I would agree. I would say that when you display a photo or video, you're showing people where you are, and it says a lot about the setting. It may also say something about the character as well.
Yeah. Amar says possibly the theme, and Tuba says describing the characters and setting. Kamal says the character as well. And Muhammad says settings and character as well. So thank you for your responses.
That's great. And I think depending on the photo that you include, both of those are correct. You may or may not have a character in your picture, but if you do, you certainly will have characters, and whatever the surroundings are would be the setting. How about the check-in box? What would you say that one is?
The check-in box, is that the part where we tell people where we are?
It is.
Like I'm checking into the library?
Exactly.
Something like that. All right, what do you think, everyone? What would that be? So Anva says maybe the setting. Let's see, what do you think for the check-in piece, everyone? I think possibly setting. I might say setting too, to be honest. Faisal says it might depend on what you post. Hannah says check-in is the setting. So does Yusuf and Saima. What do we think?
I agree. Check-in is your location. So it is telling us where the story is happening. So it's your setting. And you can proceed in a similar way, asking about the other components. If we go to tagging friends, that will indicate characters and also possibly your audience, because if a friend is not in a photo with you, you may actually attach a tag just so that friend reads your post and they are now the audience for this post. Or you can tag specific characters who are in the post with you. We can also talk about plot. The what's on your mind prompt at the top is really what's the action, what's going on. That ties directly to plot in narrative writing. Then if we go down to that emoji with the feeling and activity, that really is character development. It's showing how your character is feeling, assuming one of your characters in this story is yourself. you're talking about how you're feeling, and you're telling us something about that character. And then finally, up at the top left, I've circled my picture, and this is point of view, because this picture is the person who's posting. So this post is being made from that person's point of view. So my action is coming from my own personal point of view. It's a first person narrative. So through this activity, we're able to make connections between the social media platform the students are familiar with and our learning objectives on in narrative writing. And what we in fact do, hopefully, is convince students that every day they are actually narrative writers already. So if they think this is a daunting task, we're showing them that in fact, each day by composing any kind of status update on any of their social media platforms, they are in essence doing narrative writing, and they're already very adept at it. So hopefully that will ease them in to writing longer pieces for us in the classroom.
What a great connection. And you can see directly right there how you're tying in something that's a real part of students' lives to a language and learning objective. Thanks for showing that to us.
So that's the first activity of 3 that we have today. The second one that we're going to look at, now we'll delve into building characters a bit through social media profiles. And we're going to do this by looking at our model text and assigning characters from the model text to pairs or small groups of students, then displaying a profile template, which would be the piece of your social media platform that allows you to tell your audience more about who you are. And then groups are each going to create profile posters for their assigned characters. Students will then share these with the class and then reflect on this activity and consider character development strategies. So once again, we'll take a look at each of these steps.
Sounds good.
Okay, the first one that we have is displaying a profile template for your social media character or for your story character. So if we switch to the next slide, you'll see an example of Cinderella. So this group has been assigned Cinderella. And first, I'm just going to display a template, which is a little difficult to see. So on the left, I've highlighted the categories that you're able to fill out on a social media profile. You can see there's an overview which allows the person or character to tell a little bit of their story. There's a work and education option where you can choose jobs or fill in where you've gone to school. You can talk about places you've lived, fill in your contact information, talk about your families and your relationships, provide details about yourself, and then highlight any important life events. So the purpose of this profile template is just to remind students of all the tools that are available to them when creating a social media profile. Then it would be useful to just leave this posted as you let students begin to work. And what you'll see on the next slide is an example of what a group of students came up with in a high-tech classroom for a Cinderella profile. So under the introduction, they wrote Cinderella, Cinders, or Cindy, whatever, my beautiful spirit will belie this ugly life one day. Will defy this ugly life one day.
That's funny.
Yes, she has an attitude in this particular group. They made her self-employed. She went to the School of Hard Knocks. She lived in Orlando, Florida, which was cute. And then her relationship status was complicated.
I guess maybe this was in the middle of the story, yeah? Before the end. That's great.
Happily. So one thing I'd like to point out here is that this is a really useful activity if you have learners of different language levels working together, because these social media profiles often allow for some creativity and also some situations where you can check boxes. So for some students, this could be a reading comprehension activity, understanding which marital status or relationship status they want to choose. And they're choosing from a selection, and they don't need to be creative. They just need to express their comprehension skills. Whereas some of the higher level students may be able to write a funny introduction or manage a conversation within their group to create this profile. So it really enables language learners of different levels to work together. And just to emphasize that this can be done in a low-tech setting as well. Our next slide shows an example of a low-tech poster.
Nice.
So this, yeah. So this group has the prince and They gave Prince Charming an introduction, the sweetest guy around, forever searching for my princess and true love. His occupation was a king in training. His education was he studied at the University of Royalty, and he lives in the castle by the river. They added lots of life events that a prince might experience. And then finally, his relationship, they took a little liberty here and classified him as single but seeking.
I love the creativity that can be shown in these activities. Again, with being familiar with the social media platform, I think it really enables students to be able to think of creative and fun ideas as they're participating in these activities.
Exactly. And it really comes back to you as a teacher being prepared and having adequate visuals for whatever your setting is. So if you have a no tech setting that you're working in, but you know your students use social media away from the classroom, you may just need to make a few posters just like this to bring in and remind them of what the template would look like, what you're modeling, and they can use their background knowledge about social media to do the same activity, even though you're not connected in the classroom.
Great, perfect.
And then of course, there's the processing piece, which on the next slide, you'll see some great questions to think about that will tie this back to our learning objectives. So first you could ask students if it was easy to create a profile for their character and have them think about why it was easy or why it was difficult. And hopefully what they will come to is thinking about whether the author gave them enough information about their character, or if they knew enough about the character's personality to infer or make guesses about how he or she would write a profile. So they think about characterization. That's the second question. Were you able to make predictions about what your character would have written? And consider how this relates to direct and indirect characterization. You may want to review with students here that direct characterization is when the author tells you exactly what they want you to know about the character. They say Cinderella is tall and 25 years old and has 3 stepsisters and is a hard worker. But inferences or indirect characterization requires you to know that Cinderella is a kind spirit and how she would react in different situations, so that you can then make assumptions about what she might write when you go to fill out her profile. You could ask students to think about which one is more interesting to them, whether they can decide or whether they like both. And then finally, in moving from a reading activity to a writing activity, you want students to think about how they could use social media profiles to improve their own writing. Some suggestions that I have for that are that they could scaffold their characters before they write their story. So if they think they have 3 strong characters for a story, they might try to fill out a profile for each of them and decide if they have enough information to do that. They could also write their story and ask a friend to do that in a peer editing process. So use this as a tool to edit their writing after it's been written.
Great. Let's move on to the third activity, just to make sure we have time to share the last wonderful social media connected to narrative writing activity.
So perfect. So here we go. Now we've talked about characters and we're going to move on to plot. So we're going to talk about how status updates now connect to plot development in a story. Once again, you'll have your students work in small groups or pairs assigned to the same character ideally. And in those groups, they'll retell the story from the model text, but from the perspective of whichever character they've been assigned. Then once again, you'll display a sample plot diagram and a sample status update so students can see what the goal is. You're going to ask them to write updates from their assigned character's point of view and then have them share. Their goal is to retell the whole story from their character's perspective in just 6 status updates. So they need to figure out the essential components of the plot. So if we move to the next slide, you can see that the first step is to have your students retell the story. You group them, they talk from their character's point of view and decide which 6 elements they would choose to retell the essential components of the story, in this case, Cinderella. Then on the following slide, you'll see that we put up a plot diagram just to remind them of the trajectory or the progression of a story. and then display a sample status update. Now, I've chosen one here from Cinderella. We have Cindy loves to write, feeling excited at Neuschwanstein Castle, so she's indicated her location. Her status update is my carriage awaits, heading to the ball in style. And then she's chosen to add a few hashtags: fairy godmother's rock, this is how I roll, sorry stepsisters, and karma. And then of course the photo of her horses and the coachman who is driving her to the ball. This is just one example of a status update that one character would write in this activity. Does anyone have a suggestion about which piece of the plot diagram this would fit into?
I'm just going to go ahead and say I think it is probably the rising action.
I think you're right.
And I think we should quickly go through the rest. We hope everyone stays for the last 2 minutes. We're almost finished. We're going to share a little bit more about this activity, and then that's it. But yeah, so anyways, continue. Thank you so much.
So the next slide just shows a low-tech example of this to show you once again that this can be done with markers and paper. And then finally, we come to the reflection questions, where it's important to process with students what you've done through this activity. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the suggestions. Or did you agree on the essential elements of the story? So did different groups choose the same 6 elements? Ask students to think about whether or not the story changed depending on which character was narrating it and how different points of view affected the storyline. Ask students to think about the connections between this activity and writing a story summary. They've essentially summarized a story in 6 points by doing this activity. And then finally, have them think about applications to writing again. How could they use this same activity to plan their own writing? Could they think of 6 essential elements to their story and plot them out and write status updates before they fill in the rest of the story to make things come together in a logical way?
Great.
Okay, so that's my final activity for you. And on this last slide, you can just see a quick overview of the 3 activities that we did: connecting social media to the components of narrative writing, first of all, then using social media to develop and analyze characters, and finally linking status updates on social media to plot development in narrative writing.
Great activities. Thanks for sharing those.
And then on this last slide, on this last slide, we just have some examples about different ways that you could extend this activity to incorporate other language skills and other social media platforms.
Wonderful.
And finally, I just want to encourage all of you to just brainstorm with your colleagues, get excited about the different possibilities that there are with social media. This is just tapping the tip of the iceberg, as they say, with getting you started with ideas. And hopefully this got you excited about using social media in the classroom, and you'll think of ways that you can continue this conversation with your colleagues and bring it into your own classrooms. The possibilities are limitless. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that wonderful session. And I wanted to tell everyone that you can stay tuned. The next, the winter edition of 2019 English Teaching Forum will have an article written by our very own Jennifer Bork on this very same topic, teaching narrative writing with Facebook, embracing social media to engage students in the English language classroom. So stay tuned for that. Be sure to check it out when it comes out. You can get even more ideas there. And you can also get lots of ideas on AmericanEnglishWebinars.com, our online Ning or community of practice for webinar participants such as yourselves. And we'll also post this on our website, AmericanEnglish.state.gov. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for that engagement.